Hey, everybody, welcome to this week's installment for the StoneX Fertilizer YouTube video. We're going to focus in on the phosphate market, just the global phosphate market, a little bit more education as far as where the stuff come from, where does it go to. As always, I'm Josh Linville. I'm the Vice President of the Fertilizer Division for StoneX Financial Inc., FCM Division. And when we look at the phosphate market, this is, of course, a very large market globally. It is a lot of tons that are produced. It is a worldwide market. Of course, we all rely on it for our food production, consumption, everything else. But what I really want to dial you into is that even though it's a massive market, it really dials down to just a few nations around the world that really control it. And, when you look at nitrogen products, it's one of those things where it's easier to step into that market. If you have a natural gas supply, which of course there's a lot of that around the world, you can make fertilizer. Now, there's questions about efficiency and how close or how far away you are from the demand point, but it's a relatively easy entry. When you start getting into something like phosphate, and potash is very similar, you cannot do that unless you have access to that phosphate rock. Now, there are some facilities around the world that purchase that phosphate rock and then upgrade it into a finished material and then ship it out. But a lot more of it is actually produced right around where it's mined. And so it becomes very, very difficult to basically find that new phosphate rock reserve that we don't already find. It's not something that happens every day. So let's go ahead and dive into the information. Number one, like I said, it is a massive global fertilizer market. And when you look at consumption back in 2022, and I'm going to use 2022, I know it's 24, that's, we're a couple of years behind, but this is the information that we have. It typically comes out a couple of years, a year and a half later. So we're updated through 22. Consumption was sitting around 62.5 million tons globally. Of that, only about 26.5 million ton is exported. And so that differential is just basically sitting there saying, listen, there are countries who produce a lot of tons, but they don't export anything. Um, but we like to focus in on the export market because that's really where the trade flows and the prices are typically set. And if you start to see some of these few countries who do a lot of exports, if there are restrictions, all of a sudden it starts to have a very big impact very quickly. So, who controls those exports? This is a short list. Typically speaking, we try to go to the 10th country as far as exports go. This one only has seven, and you can kind of see why. After you get through the first five, it falls off dramatically. Jordan doesn't reach 600,000 ton in 2023. Australia is just over 300,000 in 2023. So you look at these countries and you're saying Morocco, China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the US. These five countries control most of that world flow. And so, okay, let's go back to the 22 because that's what we have for consumption. That's what we have for exports. And that's what we have broken down per country. When we look at the global export number for 2022, that number is about 26.647 million metric ton. The top five countries in 2022, the same five countries I just listed off, just a little over 23.7 million ton. Guys, the top five phosphate exporting countries in the world controlled almost 90% of that export flow. It's 89 in a very small piece. It is a massive amount controlled by very, very few. And so let's just go ahead and walk through these countries. And I'm going to go off the 2023 list. Now, I'm going to tell you, typically speaking, China is the largest, but they have not been here in recent years. Morocco has taken that throne. Maybe China comes back and dethrones them, takes that spot back over. We don't know. As of right now, we got to claim Morocco's number one. And they're kind of relatively new as far as being a phosphate powerhouse here in the last decade. About a decade ago, I was working for a company who actually partnered with them very closely, and I got to watch the process where they started to increase their production rates and started to become the beast that they are. When we look at Morocco, a relatively safe country, there is some questions as far as the politics of the sub-Saharan situation and things like that. But when you look at them, they've got a lot of phosphate rock reserves. They've got a desire to capitalize on the global market, basically meaning they want to produce the phosphate, ship it around, and bring those dollars in. So Morocco continues to be looking as though they are a very solid and safe partner in the world. China's number two. Typically speaking, China, like I said, was number one, and they were massive. They were so much bigger than everybody else out there. Typically 9+ million metric ton a year. But here in the last few years, and I know everybody here has felt this, phosphate prices have been incredibly high and inventory is incredibly tight. This peaked back in early 2022. The Chinese government stepped in and say, enough. We are not going to let our exporters export everything that we have to the rest of the world and leave our farmers at a disadvantage. The government started to step in and play a role in it, and they started to put restrictions on those exports, basically meaning we've got plenty of supply for our own farmers and we're going to keep our domestic price down. And, unfortunately, it worked, and they continue to do that today. So 2023, where they would normally export 9+ million ton, they're only 7 million ton. And there continues to be questions. Actually, right now, June and July, their exports had been restricted once again. And that's helped to buoy some of these global price ideas. China can be the boogeyman of the world market. When they want to sell, you better get out of the way. They are going to sell tons. But when they remove themselves from the marketplace, it does allow those prices to start floating higher. Saudi Arabia, number 3 on the list, another somewhat relative newcomer on the global stage. A company over there called Madden controls most of it, but they are a very steady producer, a very steady supplier. They are a country the world looks at and says, I can kind of count on them. I don't have to worry about the politics about what will or will not be available. Talking about politics, Russia, their exports have actually risen. So a large part of why we peaked in 2022 as far as pricing go is because we all thought when Russia invaded Ukraine, we were going to lose all their exports. Everybody was going to shut them off. They were so outraged by it. Not only did they not get cut out completely, their exports have actually increased. That has helped to offset some of these situations we've got going on with China. So that's a great win from that perspective. But let's face it, there's a lot of concern that we have politically when it comes to Russia. Now, they're not the biggest in this list, but they are a big enough part of it that as we look at them and we continue to see them in Ukraine, we continue to see that war, and we continue to see a slight escalation on the arms side for both sides of it, and a lot of talking back and forth. We don't think it's going to get to a very bad situation, but it doesn't feel like we're very far away either. So, Russia, a little bit of a concern short term here. And then last on the list is US. Now, long-term history, they have been a very steady producer and exporter. We have. A lot of that production is down around Florida. In fact, if you drive around Florida, most of the state, if you see a hill anywhere in the state, it's probably around a phosphate mine, and that's the tailing piles. It's the gypsum that's a byproduct of the phosphate production. But there's a lot of questions around the longevity of that production. We think the Pacific Northwest production is doing fine. Some other places are doing okay, but Florida is an issue. Mosaic dominates the production down there, and they're doing a great job with it. But the problem is they're hemmed in. They're not allowed to go beyond their current borders. There is more phosphate rock reserves in the state of Florida, but when you go to Florida, what do you see? You see tourists. You don't see the government that is relying on phosphate production income to run everything. They want those dollars, baby. They are getting dollars from people going to NASA to watch rockets take off. They are getting dollars from people that want to go jump in the ocean, and they're getting dollars from people that want to go to see Mickey Mouse in Orlando. Phosphate just doesn't really meet it. And honestly, when you start to bring in the environmental side of it, they're sitting there saying, listen, these tailing piles, they're horrible, they're terrible, slight radioactive tinge to it. And Florida's full of sinkholes. And we've had that happen where a sinkhole opened in the middle of one. And of course, the helicopters are taking video and just watching water rushing down into the hole, and one breached over by Tampa into the bay. There's a history there. And so the environmentalists push back, and it's not that we couldn't increase the amount of production there. It's just that they're not really being allowed to now. And the phosphate rock reserves that they have access to continues to shrink year after year. Now, since I've been in the industry, it's always seemed like they're always like a decade or two away and they're going to run out of rock. And we keep hearing that. It keeps being a decade or two out. But here recently, I've heard a little bit more firm talk that we do need to be worried, not really in the long term, about how much longer that phosphate production is going to be viable. So, US number 5, how long can it hold on? And after you get past the US, it falls way, way off. If the US is about 2.5 million tons per year, Jordan's number 6 at 584,000. They couldn't even reach 6,000. I'm not saying that like, oh, you couldn't even get there. It's just they don't have the production capacity. They don't need to export that much. Australia falls off even further. Your number 6 and 7 don't even equal a million tons exported. So this is why we're trying to show just how small of a market this really is. It's a massive market. Like I said, tens of millions of tons produced every single year, plenty of tons produced or exported around the world, but it really comes down to 5 nations. And just a quick glance at the top importers. If we're talking about the exporters, the imported side is also just as important. In 23, India, biggest buyer out there. And it's a very big margin between them and number 2 in Brazil. And Brazil's no slouch. These 2 countries dominate the buy side, and right now there's actually an interesting situation with India. The Indian government keeps the price of fertilizers to its farmers steady, and it puts a subsidy program in place so that importers can bring product in, not lose money. Well, the problem is their current subsidy program is not allowing them to bring product in without losing cash. And they're basically saying, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to sit there and bring stuff in just so I lose money. Heck with that. Well, as of yesterday, we knew their stockpiles were getting fairly low and their imports have been slowing fairly well down. The government didn't change the subsidy program. So their demand continues to build, their stockpiles continue to fall. But we think that we're going to see a change in the subsidy program probably early August. And when that happens, we're afraid the world's biggest buyer, and it's not even a close second, kind of becomes a black hole, a vacuum cleaner of demand. Anything they can do to start buying product and get that flow coming back in and start building those inventories back up, because again, the farmers will not be happy if they find out there's not enough product around. They are going to become a huge buyer. Your world's largest buyer is about to come back in a very, very big way. So while we're talking here in North America about high phosphate prices in relation to low grain prices and what that demand destruction looks like, the world's biggest buyer may completely outpace any story that goes. So this is not to say, these are the largest consumers. When I go through the list of the importers, it's not to sit there and say India is the largest consumer. This is just the largest importers. And again, as we start to look at the global trade back and forth, which is really what typically sets that price for a lot of different perspectives, that's why we look at it like we do. So just make sure that when you look at these lists, you're not sitting there saying, "Oh, India is the biggest consumer of it." No, they just buy the most. Brazil buys the second most in the world. And with the export production list being relatively small, it does make it a bit easier to track the situation in this market versus something like urea. Urea is produced all around the world, tons of producers, tons of countries. That top 10 list for urea, it's big, a lot of tons, and it's spread out. But that still means there's plenty of stumbling blocks. You know, when you start going through that top 5 list, when you look at Russia and the political situation there, when you look at the Chinese government intervention, there are still plenty of stumbling blocks. And we sit there and we look at these markets like, well, they should be doing this and it should be doing that. You're right, guys. A huge conversation for this fall 24, spring 25, for at least North America side, is the phosphate price is really, really high and the grain prices stink right now. The conversation should be, we're going to see less demand this fall, either by a reduction in application rate or farmers waiting until next spring. And that's actually the right answer. That is the right thing that we are watching. But when you start to talk about some of the biggest exporters in a very narrow window of exporters, that can, surpass that whole conversation. So we could see demand down here, but globally prices start going up and we're going to get pulled with it. So always remember, keep your eyes on the horizon. We are part of this world market, whether we like it or not. So that's it for this week. Like I said, just want to cover the phosphate. We'll probably hit potash next time. If you're not on Twitter, go over there. Great information, great ag stuff out. I try to put stuff out every single day. You can find me at J Linville Fert. If you haven't done so, I put out a monthly farmer newsletter. I'm actually going to be doing it next week. You can Google that StoneX Farmer Fertilizer Newsletter and find the registration site there. Uh, go to stonex.com for more information on the company. But otherwise, guys, I appreciate it. And we'll see you next week.